All right, thank you everyone, and thank you again for being here. As John and Dave mentioned, I'm Rachel Lippmann. I work in St. Louis, so this is usually about our June weather that you guys are getting here in April. And this project that turned into what we called Unsolved, that through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And we were one of the stations that got involved. APM reports that want to do this, but maybe don't have the editing, data tools, etc. to do. And the question that I decided I wanted to explore, another colleague of mine who has since moved on to edit a podcast that works for APM, actually, the broader company, is now at Science Friday doing their Kids Science podcast. She wanted to look into how the city had handled the response with their unhoused population in the COVID pandemic. And I want to tackle a question about unsolved homicides. And specifically, who is being killed in the city, whose cases are being solved, and really why is the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department so dang bad at solving homicides? Because we knew that they weren't good. You could see kind of the overall clearance numbers, but we wanted to get a little bit more information about why they were so bad, and really, where were they bad? Were there pockets in the city where they weren't solving crimes? Were there types of people, individuals, where the cases weren't getting solved? And we have this theory that the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014 might have been a turning point for these clearance rates. That mistrust in police hit an all-time low after that incident, and that contributes to people just not being willing to come forward and provide information, in addition to combining with the volume of homicides going up. So you have more crimes occurring, less people to work on it, less time to devote to it, people are mistrustful, it just becomes this loop. And we knew there was data available out there to help us answer this question, because the Washington Post in 2017 and 2018 did a story similar to this. It got a little bit less granular in terms of who the victims were, but it looked at like pockets where there were a lot of killings and a lot of unsolved, or areas where police were doing better at it. And they had collected the data from about 11 years, 2008 to 2018 roughly. So we knew it existed. And the Washington Post had even made this data publicly available for us to access, so we could look at it. But we started working on the story in December of 2020. 18 to 20 is a gap of time. We wanted to be able to fill in, get a little bit more information. So we filed some open records requests. Followed the first request on February 2nd, 2021. And what we had seen already in the Washington Post data was that the raw number of homicides were up, and the clearance rates, or the number of homicides that police considered solved, had been going down. And we're like, okay, this should be a pretty easy story to write. We'll just ask for the updated numbers, get a little bit more information, maybe get some data on the race of the victims, do some math, make the computers work for us, write the story, easy peasy lemon squeezy, right? Well, no. Made my first data request on February 2nd of 2021. The department said, nope, we're not giving you this information. Remember how I just told you that the Washington Post had gotten this information in 2017 and 2018? Nothing had changed in Missouri's open records laws at all, where they could point to and say, this is a new part of the law. They had just decided that they didn't want to tell us whether a homicide case was cleared or not, whether they had made an arrest. They called it part of the investigative file, which is a closed record in the state of Missouri. And they told us they kept the data, they just didn't want to give it to us. So Washington University, our big private institution in St. Louis, has a First Amendment clinic, and they said, we'll send them a letter, sign an agreement with us, we'll send them a letter and tell them, hey, we think you're doing the wrong thing. Again, they said no. This was May of 2021. I sent an email to the then interim public safety director, the mayor's chief of staff, and the mayor's spokesperson in May of 2021. And they still went no. When I called Stephen Rich, who is now with the New York Times, but was then with the Washington Post, who collected the data, his response when I told him, hey, they're not giving us this, was, that's ludicrous. It was a polite, radio-friendly way of saying that is BS. So we make another updated request in January of 2020, excuse me, June of 2021, making it exactly the same as the Washington Post's request. So word for word, what they had requested, we changed a couple of dates. I don't officially remember when that request got denied, but it also got denied. They're just not giving us this data. They don't want to give us this data, and they are hiding behind the Missouri Sunshine Law, which they have previously used to give the data. The funny part about this all was we asked for emails between the Washington Post and the SLMPD so we could find the exact language of the request we used, because we figured, all right, they can't deny a request that's already been made. As part of that email, one of the attachments they gave us, take a wild guess what one of those attachments might have been.
The data.
A PDF format of the data we were asking for in spreadsheet format. So it wasn't closed when they put it on as an attachment to the email, but they just didn't want to give it to us in raw format so that we could do some, work with it. Now, any skeptics in the room will know that when a government is all of a sudden not making data available that it previously made available, and even for journalists, your spidey sense starts to tingle a little bit and you're going, something's not right here, why do they not want to give us this updated data? We're starting to run into another problem though. This grant that I was working under was set to run out in December. We're getting up in like August, September, October, and going, what are we going to do? We have to publish a story off of this grant. And we don't really feel comfortable using the data that's available because it doesn't show anything past 2018. And we want to be as fair to the department as we can. So we start thinking we're going to have to sue to get the records. And the story, in the immortal words of Ross from Friends, we had to pivot. And the story started becoming a lack of transparency in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. Because not only are they not giving us the data, we heard from so many families that we talked to that they couldn't even get information from the detectives. The detectives assigned to their case weren't giving them information. There was no back and forth. They couldn't find out, do you have any updates? Has anything happened? And when I would talk to these families, they were saying, we don't necessarily want to know if they've solved the case. Like, they understood the case may not get solved. They just wanted to know that their family member was a priority or that they had been working on it. We had politicians tell us, yeah, they don't really answer our questions. One of them admitted that he didn't really push very hard for the answers. But that just became the story, was that the police department was stonewalling everybody. And that was the first story that we published on the day that we filed the lawsuit, which was filed November 21st, 2021. 9 months after our original records request. I went from, I had been engaged before, but in the time that it took to kind of get the data, a lot of time ended up passing. I got a COVID vaccine, got married, and purchased a house, and the time it took for them to file a lawsuit and the city to settle and do all of the data analysis. The other hurdle that we started running into was not open records related, it was university bureaucracy related. The University of Missouri holds the license for my radio station, so I am technically a state employee. And Washington University was more than willing to help out and say, yes, you can be our client, it's free to use because it's the chance for the law students to get the experience. My university went, no, I don't think we want that. You'll have to become a university vendor. We're not sure. We've never worked with this. So we had to file the exact same request, except Tom had to be the one to make the request so that they could deny Tom's request, and then he could be the one to sue. And then we waited. We published our first story about the lack of transparency in the SLMPD, and then we waited, and waited, and waited until June of 2023. And I'm going to let Tom take over from there because he remembers all the details of the lawsuit because I wasn't involved in it.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me and us. We appreciate it. As Rachel mentioned, we talked a little bit about, we were on a grant. So we had a grant that was running out. And one of the things that I really appreciated about our organizations was their commitment to the story. Even though we were not going to continue to get grant money to have the story, our editors said, this is pretty important, let's pursue it. And I think our conversation with my boss at the time took about 20 seconds for him to say, yes, we're going to sue, and you should be the main plaintiff in this case. And so we sued. As Rachel mentioned, she got married, and then we waited. And there were some quirky things that happened. The judge had her hip replaced, and so things went sideways. We had to wait. She came back. The city actually made a request or a motion to dismiss because I didn't live in Missouri, because I live in Minnesota where it's 45 degrees. And but what they said was, oh, you're not a citizen of Missouri, so you shouldn't have standing, even though there's nothing in the law that says I shouldn't have standing. Anyone anywhere in the United States could get or any in the world could get a record if they asked for it through the public records law. So we had to go through that, go through a motion to dismiss. The judge ends up getting changed, and this was I think one of the more stressful moments of this whole situation for me was because the judge who got the case was a former attorney for the city of St. Louis who represented the police department. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst. Like, this is only going to get worse and worse. He's going to deny us. And I called our attorney. I said, can we kick this? Can we get this judge off of here? And Lisa, to her credit, said, well, we could try, but if we lose, you're going to get in trouble. And it was a blessing in disguise because this judge had to process these requests, knew what it was all about. And so when there was a hearing to discuss this, he looked at the city, he looked at us, and he said, how are you guys not getting a settlement here? How are you guys not agreeing on this? And that was the point in time where the city attorney finally came to our lawyer and said, let's talk. And that took a long time, but they ended up giving us a settlement agreement where they said, we will give you the Washington Post data, even though we had it, and then we'll give you updated data for each of the years. Now this really matters because they do give this information to the FBI, but for us, we wanted to know it on the granular level, by person, John Doe, Jane Doe, how old were they, where were they murdered, what race were they, how were they murdered, those types of things. And so that was really important. The other thing that we really felt when we realized that we were going through this was, okay, well, if the city's going to mess around, now they're going to find out. We had an opportunity of months, because we knew this was going to take a long time, and this is actually, if you look, when we talk about St. Louis, it's repeatedly had one of the highest murder rates in the country. So you can see this is from 2010 over here, and about 2014 the number starts going up and up and up and up. Yeah. This is 2020. Now one of the theories I have about why they didn't want to give the data was because that murder rate that they had was so long, it was so high, it was the highest in like 50 years, and they just didn't want to talk about it. Anyway, so we decided at that point, Rachel and I got in a room and said, what else do we want to know? We want to know the numbers. But we also want to know the why, right? What is the reason that they're not solving these murder rates? And so what we really started to do was, well, is it problem police officers? So we started to ask for individual records, any complaints against any police officer, homicide detective. We got the list of detectives that we knew. And so we said, okay, any complaint against them, we want that. Any lawsuit against them, we want that information. We met with the police union and we met with other detectives, and they said, listen, we know we're going to get killed on this, but we really think you need to know staffing went down. And so staffing is a money thing. So we started to ask for specific budget-related documents to look to see how the homicide department, even though this number is going way up, if you look at a number going, the homicide division of detectives is going the other way. So it was a situation where they were shrinking and being asked to investigate more additional murders. And then the other thing they said is, it's really hard to solve a murder when we're not getting our DNA evidence back. And so we said, oh, well, we can ask for, and that was the thing we just saw here, we can ask for DNA records. So we went to the city and they said, oh, it's going to take us a long time to get it. This is the first in my career of asking for public records, because typically you go to the state to get records from the federal government, because the federal government is so slow. In this instance, we went to the United States Justice Department, because they were giving grants out to all these cities. We said, do you have any grant reports that you could give us on these DNA samples? And so this comes from a grant report that outlines all of the budget cuts they had. There was like a 3-year wait for them to process a homicide investigation related to DNA. So, like, you can't fully blame a homicide detective if he's waiting for 3 years to get DNA evidence back. It's even worse for sexual assaults and things like that. So we got all of that time. I always joke with Rachel that if they would have just gave us the initial information, they would have got a story that would have outlined, okay, this is the homicide rate, this is where people were murdered, this is what was solved, this was what wasn't, by race, etc. Instead, we ended up doing a 5-part series that looked at money, looked at the DNA backlog, looked at all of these other things because they ended up fighting the lawsuit, and we ended up fighting the lawsuit until they eventually settled. So we went through the rejection phase. This was kind of our reporting phase, our recalibration phase, I would say, and then Alysia's just going to talk a little bit about the reporting phase once we started to get the data in, because they ended up settling with us to give it to us at one point.
I want to jump in and add one more thing before Alysia gets up on the open records side. Remember how Tom mentioned that we got some list of the homicide detectives? We never knew exactly who was in homicide because they refused to give us that information. I forgot which of the exemptions they cited. I think it was safety. They didn't want to compromise officer safety. So what I did was I'd get emails about when the police had made an arrest in homicide. It was just the media alert from the SLMPD. And I would go down to our courthouse and look up the probable cause statements and write down who the detective was on that case. We know there are homicide detectives we missed getting background information on because we never got the list. So that was another example of, all right, we're going to find a way to work around the system.
Hey everyone.
Hi.
So I'm Alysia, I'm from the Marshall Project. I joined the project, they had the data in hand at that time. So I came along at a point where a lot of the battle had been won by these two. And my job at that point was to join them and help structuring what the stories were all going to cover, what cases we were going to look at, and also how we were going to present our data analysis. So by this point, we knew there was over 1,000 unsolved homicides in the city over a 10-year period. We also knew that there was disparities in solve rates. So white victims, those homicides were being solved at a much higher rate than the black victims were. So I wrote the first story in the series and had to find a case to write about to bring readers through this. And ended up writing about a triple murder that happened where 3 young women in their 20s were all killed in the back of a car, huddling together, trying to protect each other, shot through the car, all 3 died. And this was sort of, in a city with so many crimes, this one was particularly brutal. It had so many victims. These women just had run out of their house away from whoever this perpetrator was. And it was never solved. So using that story, we knew we wanted to write about that one, so I started looking for the families of these 3 women. Eventually, this is the graphic we wanted to show too. So I'll go to this in a second, Sydney, I'll just finish this one story. But the story we ended up telling about them is how this murder was unsolved, and then one of the sisters of the victims felt that some people knew things that they weren't saying and did not trust that the police were going to do anything about it. And so she took it into her own hands and actually shot at a car full of family members of one of the other victims who had died. So this was emblematic though of how people feel when they don't have hope that anything will be solved. This was kind of our way of explaining through one example how violence can be fueled when things aren't solved and when people feel that there is no way that their loved one is going to have any justice unless they find the justice for them. So I thought we could maybe just go through this graphic because one of the things we really, with all this data, is presenting it beautifully, and I think that we did that. So if you want to just scroll through it, so this is where we show the orange dots are unsolved and the blue dots are solved. So we zoom in on some neighborhoods had many more unsolved than solved. You could actually see by neighborhood where they just barely solved any, and then some neighborhoods they solved a bunch. This is the neighborhood where those 3 women were killed, and so we focused on this for our graphic, 37 homicides in 10 years that, and more than half of them had not been solved. And so then we zoom in on our one location here, and this is where two of these women lived here. One of them was their friend, and this is where they were all killed. We later made another graphic actually where it's not part of this one. You can actually show it, Sydney, if you don't mind. If you scroll all the way down to the next graphic, I love this graphic because I think it really explains for people what it means to live in a neighborhood where murders are not solved and what that can do to an investigation or how you can put yourself in that person's shoes. So here's where that murder happened, these 3 women killed. Then you look right here, unsolved murder of a 17-year-old boy right behind the house. Had happened 10 years previously. Then, right over here, a few steps away, 0.1 mile, another unsolved murder. Another unsolved murder, a few steps. We tried to fill in details where we could to make it beyond just, a name, but maybe a little detail. So like the 17-year-old boy, and one was a mom of 5. And then another right down the road. And I think I got kind of obsessed in this story with portraying this because I thought to myself, if I was someone that lived in a neighborhood like this and the police came and they wanted help and I could look around and see all these places people were murdered and it wasn't solved and I would know that would put a target on me, why would I help the police? Wouldn't that be such a huge risk? And would I want to undertake it for them to just not solve it? No, I probably wouldn't, right? So, we're getting into this like blurry line between victim and perpetrator. And then all the reporting they did, the detectives, all the different problems, why it ended up this way. So that's the first story of the series, and the later stories get into a lot more detail about what police were doing wrong and what exactly was going on behind the scenes that led to this.
This is fascinating on several levels. One is the hard work just to get your foot in the door, which took years. And then the personalization of a report, which takes it from the abstract to the very, very real. And how important each of these elements are. The persistent people and the writer who is writing on factual things that move people. And this is how a society should work. And we're very proud of you. I know 2 of you have commitments, but Tom is going to stay with us. And he is the one who filed the suit. I'm curious about suits now. Thank you very much. Because there's a lot of suits going on in Washington and elsewhere. And so, Tom, if you'd like to make some remarks, then we're going to open it up to questions. He's familiar with the whole project. I will say one more thing. In coming up with some introduction myself, I checked some of these groups, such as the Marshall Project and AP, it's called APM Reports, and they have great websites and discussion on their what drives them. So, for instance, the Marshall Project has had a real interest in incarcerated people, and we've heard of the Justice Project elsewhere and this sort of thing. So there's a lot going on in this country. We miss our local newspaper. I was talking to Tom about it. But others have picked up the sword and continue fighting for fairness in our society. So we appreciate that.
Thank you. I'll take questions in a minute, but I'll just tell you the iteration of the stories we did. So the first story was kind of the broad story that looked at, hey, this is the broad number. 2,000 murders over 20 years in St. Louis. Less than half were solved. That's what you see here. The second story that we looked at, and Rachel mentioned it earlier, our initial theory was that what happened in Ferguson and Michael Brown would be the reason why the numbers are going down. And actually the numbers started going down prior to that, around 2011, 2012, those numbers started to get worse, and it got worse over time, especially during 2019 and 2020 during COVID. There were significant budget cuts at that time. So the second story we did was on race, and this was an instance where we were trying to tell this story in a different way, and so I looked at a map, just like Alysia did, and I went to North St. Louis, where a lot of these murders are, and I found a 2-block area where there were 8 murders over 20 years. It takes 4 minutes, I've done it, I have 4 minutes to walk up and down those 2 blocks. And of those 8 murders, all of them were black, none of them were solved. And I mean, it was literally, you could go from here to the parking lot and there were 6 murders that occurred over that time. And so we told the story in that way. We took a walk. I ended up, one mother of a woman who was killed was very gracious to go and talk to me where everything occurred. So that was the second story. The third story, which Rachel did, was on the problem officers. Some of them were, I guess you would characterize them almost as thumpers. They would sometimes abuse individuals or be accused of that. And other times they had drug issues and they got thrown into homicide. And other times they had other problems that were happening. We found in court records that they didn't even know how to do the basic nuts and bolts of gathering evidence. They testified under court on that. So that was the third story. The fourth story I did was on the budget. In 2012, they had about 1,500 officers. Now the department has about 700. So it is a significant deal when the budget gets cut. And it's not even, it was almost like, it's not only that the budget got cut, because the public officials would always try to say, well, we're hiring more police officers. They would budget for more police officers. They just never hired them. And that was a multiple thing. One, if you don't hire a police officer, you don't have to pay them, and the budget can stay the same. The other reason, after Ferguson, it was getting harder and harder for them to recruit people to come to the department to investigate crimes. They said, why would I want to go to St. Louis? I'm going to stay in a suburb or somewhere else. And so that was it. And then the fifth story was a bigger, broader look at why we did the story, etc. So I just wanted to give you the big, broad overview of the 4 or 5 stories we did. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them. Go ahead.
So just to give you a little information,
Sure.
just to give you a little information here in Gainesville, probably about 6 months ago, our church sponsored a banned book in downtown Gainesville on a Sunday afternoon. Our church said, oh, we need to have some security. And I do security at the church, but I called up the police department. And this lady, for the person that would handle that they referred me to, she spent about 10 minutes trying to tell me, yes, we can have a police person there off duty, and you have to pay $75 an hour, 3-hour minimum. And we didn't have the budget for that. So I told her, I said, I'll go down and do the security. On that Sunday afternoon in downtown Gainesville, and I told the lady, I said, if we see a police officer, thank them, and say, thank you for being here, and blah, blah, blah. You know, in downtown Gainesville, for that 2 or 3 hours, I did not see a cruiser go by there, or did I see anybody walking the beat. So you have, I think, overall, the police are pulling back from public engagement, even in city areas, not let alone rough areas. And that's what I experienced, because as the only person there, we had a guy come up with protesting and that, and I don't know what he was going to do, but if he would have had a gun in that, I couldn't have stopped him, and he could have done his way. So it permeates through all parts of the society. But what I've seen is the police, for whatever reason, pulling back and not engaging.
Yeah, so the gentleman was talking about how police are pulling back from some of these issues. Some of it's budget related. Some of it is they just don't want to engage. You saw that in Baltimore when Freddie Gray happened. I live in Minneapolis, George Floyd, and we saw the same thing. A lot of police officers were like, I'm just taking retirement. I'm not going to deal with it anymore. Others decided to start saying, well, I'm going to take, I have post-traumatic stress disorder, so I'm going to take workers' comp. And it was almost like a quiet strike that occurred, so some people were taking those sorts of things that also happened in St. Louis. And the union folks are like, what are we going to do? The city last year ended up spending a lot more money and a lot more money to try and recruit people. They had signing bonuses to try and have them come on. That's great for beat cops who are just coming in. But if you're a homicide detective, it's very difficult because you have to know the community has to trust you, they have to give you pretty much information that could put them, one, at risk, or two, they have to bring up something where their loved one was murdered. And they have to talk about all of these things, so it's rather difficult for them, and it's almost like the way that the detectives told us is it's a very silent skill. And oh, by the way, most of the murders occur between 11 o'clock at night and 4 in the morning. So you also are working, you're getting called at the least possible or the least appreciated hours when you're being asked to come out there. So some of them are like, I'm just not going to handle it anymore, I'm not going to deal with it. And they stay as a beat cop. So.
Do you sense that there is something that could be one huge help to solve this problem? If there were one thing we could do to improve this situation?
The question was, could be there one good thing to help solve the problem or one overarching thing? Everyone that we talked to, whether it was community members or it was police officers, it's trust. By far is the most important thing. Because there have been instances, and if you look at the stories, where someone reacts to somebody else, they think, well, this person, we know this person did it, and if the cops aren't going to get him, I'm going to get him myself. Or they know that the bad apple is in the neighborhood, and they don't think the cops are going to solve the case. So why would they put themselves at risk to say, yeah, it was so-and-so, I saw it? Because if that arrest doesn't happen or something goes sideways, that person or one of their friends could potentially harm them. So the biggest thing right now is trust. And what we saw is that the city of St. Louis is about 50% African American, and the homicide division is about 80% white. So that's the other difficult thing. Now there are some great homicide detectives who we have talked to who know how to do the work. They clear cases, they keep getting after it, and they're white. It's just a trust thing that you have to break through, and when there are problems in the community, things only get worse. They're trying to fix it, but it takes a lot of time, and it can be gone like that. So.
I actually have two questions. One, I don't know if I heard it right. She said the three victims, those three women that were killed in their car,
Yes.
that went unsolved, one of the victims' family members shot a car of another one of those victims' family?
Correct. So these three people, they lived a little bit from here, but three women were at a house. It was a home invasion. They ran out to the car. They were killed in the car. Nobody knew what happened. One of the women who was murdered, her sister suspected that these other people at the funeral did the murder. And so she and a couple other people followed this car and ended up shooting it up. And so what ended up happening is that Alysia talked to the mom who said, my one daughter is dead and gone, and my other daughter is in prison for trying to take action in her own hands. So that was what ended up happening in that case.
Okay, and my second question is, I think we've all seen 48 Hours or Dateline where these cases get solved, and then you see these ISIS supposed gang members that are arrested saying they've killed at least 50 people, and I'm like, when I see 48 Hours, I think everybody gets caught and they can't get away with it. Are they all killed like 50 people, are they not getting reported? Because I would think that would make national news if there's that many killings from these gang members.
So St. Louis is not a typical, the way we found out was St. Louis is not a typical like Bloods and Crips gang situation. It's neighborhood by neighborhood, but it's not that simple. So there are like crews that happen, but it's not like there's one gang in one neighborhood and another and another. It's different than that. But it is some gang related, it is some drug related, it's a lot of retaliatory action. Or if you shoot at me, I'm going to shoot at you, or you kill one of my friends, I'm going to go after you.
And it doesn't make the news?
Oh, it makes the news. It makes the news, and you would be shocked. I think the number of cleared cases in the last 2-3 years is 1 in 2, which is a flip of the coin. And that's not just St. Louis, that's national. And so this is like, you have a flip of a coin, In some instances, a lot of those murders are someone gets in a domestic disturbance, they take it too far, and a man kills his wife, or a woman kills her husband, or a child is murdered. Those are solved relatively quickly. But the other ones that take a lot more time are the ones where it's like someone drove by and shot into a crowd, or something like that. So,
What's the status of obtaining grants? And you would probably, Mr. Journalism, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
David.
Okay, I mean, y'all depended initially at least on grants and then your folks backed you up. But with the status of what's being slashed and burned in Washington, what's going to happen to situations or investigative journalism? And I know some of this is probably rhetorical, but, you know, that concerns me, you know, greatly. So where do we go with this then?
Well, as a public radio employee, I would say support your local public radio station. Yeah, thank you. But it is getting funding cuts. But it also is really important for you to support, if you can, and be a digital subscriber to the local newspaper. I don't know what the newspaper situation is. Yeah, so, and then the other thing is there are a lot of other organizations out there. My organization, one of the reasons that we do this work is we know there are so many holes. Rachel is a fantastic beat reporter. If we need to get something on the air in St. Louis in 10 minutes, she could do it. But this was our opportunity to teach other people how to do this work. And so and it takes a lot of time. And sometimes you work for 6 months and the story doesn't pan out. And so it's a risk too. And so in those instances, supporting organizations like the Marshall Project or APM Reports or ProPublica or other organizations that do this work, because there are a lot of us now that are starting to recognize there's this thing called a news desert, and I'm getting that sense that Gainesville has one right now, where it is, they don't even really have anybody covering a city council meeting. I graduated from college in 1996, which is for the students that I just met this morning, like, they're not even born yet. The internet was just kind of happening. My dad worked, so I'll tell a story. My dad worked at the Bethlehem Steel in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and it was a legacy industry. And everybody at my high school thought that they were going to work at the Bethlehem Steel because it was there, and it was always there. And my dad said, do not do this. It is not going to last. They're not evolving quickly enough. So I chose journalism, which is a legacy industry that ended up changing because of the internet. And so what happened was the classifieds fueled newspapers, magazine inserts that you get from the local department stores. Local department store, is it open anymore? And subscriptions drove a lot of the newspaper coverage. All of those things have kind of dried up. And so in some instances, there's nobody covering anything. So we try to come into news deserts to do it. But sometimes they're like, why would we hire an investigative reporter? We don't even cover anyone covering City Hall. So I would say try to support the local, because the local, whether it's the local student-run newspaper, who is fantastic here, buy the stuff that is their advertising. Now don't go to the 21 bar where you get all you can drink beer, but like support some of the stuff there and tell them you are showing up because you saw the ad in the newspaper. That stuff matters more than I think the general public realizes. But it is a very scary time too. I will not say that. We were talking about that. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Journalists right now are on their heels, nationally and locally.
When Rachel experienced all this blockage and all that, she went to you and kind of Ghostbusters, you know. And so, do you get a lot of requests, and then APM Reports has to sort out who they're going to help, or how does it work?
So the question was, how do we find our partners? Some of them come to us. Some of them, I always say, some of them are like predicted or found marriages, and the others are arranged. So like St. Louis Public Radio was an ambitious organization. They wanted to do this kind of work. They have a fairly large newsroom. And so they wanted to do the work, and it was my job then as a quote player coach at the time to just work with them to do the work. So the unhoused homeless story, this story, we talked about records, we talked about other things, and that's what we did. And then the other instance, journalists are incestuous in a way where we know, a lot of people know each other, and so sometimes they'll just call me and say, hey, I have this great story, can you help me with it? And then we figure out a way, either officially through a grant or unofficially, like it's like, this is what you need to do. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. You mentioned about supporting public radio. Our local representative, Kat Kamek, introduced a bill to defund National Public Radio. She and another person introduced it together. So that's who we have representing us, thanks to gerrymandering. Just wanted to point that out. Newspapers aren't dead.
Yeah, they're not dead. It's just that, like I said, everyone's on their heels. Now, every public radio station is going to be different. We all do get funding, but it varies. So bigger stations like APM, Minnesota Public Radio, we run Marketplace. We aren't going to be hit by the direct funding, but we sell Marketplace to smaller stations that air it, and they pay us for it. So it's almost like a subscription. So there will be potentially, if any of this happens, a trickle-down effect. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there's an opportunity for citizen journalism, and if so, how do you train the volunteers?
I want to walk on this line very carefully. I am a big believer in your right to petition your government and to ask for open records and to get those records and share them. One of the things I didn't mention here, which I apologize I didn't do, in that time where we were recalibrating, my attorney said, you got to call Philip Weeks. Who's Philip Weeks? Well, Philip is this gadfly in St. Louis who is really upset that the police are abusing and taking out way too many people. And I represented him because he sued the city for all of the citizen complaints against police officers. Give me Philip's number, please. So I called Philip, and Philip had boxes and boxes and databases of all of this stuff, and he just said, you can have it. I never did anything with it. I just was so mad that this was happening, and it was like, wow. So we ended up getting that, and then we would end up asking for the records to confirm them later on. So citizens matter so much. When you have a situation like this, speak out. Like, first thing I thought of is, boy, I want to know the discussion that's occurring in the legislature, in the governor's office about this. I'd also want to know what the school district is saying about it internally. Are they going to support, or say, more worried about other students as opposed to these culinary students? The problem is that, do you guys have a lot of time?
Yes.
You do? Great. It's because that's what we need. But when you have a society in a lot of instances where they're asking to do this and write and report, it increases burnout tremendously. So there'll be people who say, I'm going to do this for 2 years. They do it, they're into it, and guess what? Journalism is hard. You get doors closed in your face, people hang up on you, they don't say nice things about you, and that's a hard thing to get by. You really have to steel yourself for that. And some people are just like, I'm done. A year or two, that's it. So citizen journalists matter. I think it would be helpful if people would write. Obviously there are other places to do it, but it also is an industry. Do you call just a regular person to come fix your pipes if you have a pipe burst? Would you rely on a citizen to tell you what's happening in their government if the water gets poisoned in some way? Like, who's going to find that out? Who knows? Who knows where the bodies are buried or how to get around that kind of stuff? I've been doing this 25 years and I spend a lot of time. I characterize myself as a FOIA ninja, not like David, but I know what to ask for and how to ask for it. And I am a resource for other people, but it takes time to learn how to craft a request. To know, like, soft power, to say things like, okay, well, I'm not going to escalate here. I know you were really busy because you have a million requests you're trying to handle, government official. So if this request is too stringent, tell me, if you could give me the records that I need to tell my story and it's going to ease your burden, give those to me. We'll cut a deal. And that's kind of a negotiation that you have that you don't learn right away. too many journalists, sometimes journalists come in and they pound their fists on the table and they say, they're hiding this. In St. Louis's case, they were hiding it. In other instances, they're just busy. And they said, oh, well, if you change the request to this or make it 2 years instead of 4 years, we can get you the information. But those are things that you don't learn unless you do it on a regular basis and have a relationship. So.